It looks like the trickle is slowing. Welcome everybody to the last ISEP webinar of this academic year. My name is Johannes Urpelainen and I'm the founding director of ISEP and a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And today we are very pleased and honored to have Professor Leah Stokes from the University of California, Santa Barbara, who has done some really outstanding work on energy politics here in the United States and who's been on a grand virtual tour of the, with her new book, Short-Circuiting Policy. So the way we're going to do this is I'm just going to ask Professor Stokes first to give us a presentation that's going to be about roughly 30 minutes, give or take. And then after that, we're going to open it for Q&A. If you have questions, you can use the Q&A box at any time, and I will be then moderating the question and answer after the presentation. You can follow the work we do at ISEP on our website, which is found at size-isep.org. I'm going to put the address to the chat box. You can find later also a recording of this webinar there, that way you'll be able to follow us. We're going to take a small summer break with these webinars. We'll be back in August, but after that, I hope everybody will join us again. With that, I'd now like to invite Professor Stokes to tell us a little bit about energy issues here in the United States.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks so much for that generous introduction. And thanks so much for everybody for coming. So I'm going to share these slides and yeah, introduce you a little bit to my book, which Johannes sort of mentioned. And Johannes himself has written a great book called Renewables, which in many ways my book builds on. So I definitely recommend you check out his work as well. So the challenge that we face with the climate crisis is an issue of scale and speed. I think a lot of people don't fully understand that. Even myself, in the process of writing this book, I learned a lot more about how much faster we need to be moving, even though I've been working on climate change for 15 years. So when I got near the end of the book, I started to ask myself, what are we doing in terms of cleaning up our electricity system in the United States versus what do we need to be doing? If we were going to create benchmarks for where we should be, in terms of progress, what would that look like? And so I ended up coming up with these figures that somebody called the Narwhal Curve, which is basically the black line creates a benchmark for where we should be in terms of cleaning up the electricity system. And then you can see here that we are in some ways on track if we were trying to clean up our electricity system by 2050. And let's say we began in the year 2000. Because if we had 50 years to do it, that's 100% of the grid. And so each year we'd have to grow by 2 percentage points. And by 2018, we are at about 36%, which is 18 times 2, right? So on a certain sense, we are on track to cleaning up the grid. But what you should immediately notice looking at this picture is that nuclear and hydropower have really been allowing us to be much slower on deploying renewables. We have been living off borrowed time in a certain way. And there isn't really more nuclear or hydropower happening. These are quite flat over time. And renewables are in many ways not growing fast enough. So in the very best years in 2016 and 2017, we only grew renewables by about 1.3 percentage points of the entire grid. So that falls below that 2 percentage point benchmark. And if you think, well, actually 2050 is not fast enough, we need to be moving faster because, for example, you've read the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and you see that in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to cut emissions by about half by 2030. Well, then maybe you think, hey, we really got to move faster on electricity. And in that case, we're actually really far behind. We are not at all moving fast enough. And if instead of creating a benchmark from 2000 to 2030, you just create that black line from the tip of the green at the very end, that's the narwhal, and you draw that line straight out, it looks even steeper, right? You can immediately get a sense that the slope would be even steeper. So the fact is that a lot of people will say, oh, renewables are cheaper and we're moving so much faster, they're growing exponentially, and it's just not true. Yes, they're cheaper, yes, we're moving faster, but it is nowhere near what is necessary. And I'd also point out that the axis on this graph only goes to 100%, right? And in truth, we don't really need 100% clean electricity. We need something like 150% clean electricity or 200% clean electricity. Why do I say that? Because in order to clean up our our transportation system and our buildings, what we need to do is electrify those systems, right? We need electric vehicles. We need to get rid of gas for our cooking and our heating in our homes. And so that means we're taking energy that is being used in liquid fuels like oil in our cars or gas in our homes, and instead we're going to rely on electricity to perform those services. So that means we actually need even more electricity. And if we were to extend that axis out to 150 or 200%, just think about how much steeper that line would be. So if you're interested in this basic argument, it's of course in my book, but you can also take a look at this video that I made with my sister and an animator that describes the idea of a narwhal curve in just 3 minutes. It's really accessible. It's on Grist. And I've also written a short article about this for the Democracy Journal. So if you're interested in sort of sharing these ideas with other people, check out that video and the Democracy Journal piece. I think it really helps people understand how much faster we need to be moving on decarbonizing our electricity system in the United States. And I really do believe that decarbonizing the electricity system in the United States is the first linchpin globally for tackling the climate crisis. I know at ISEP, a lot of the focus is on India and China and the developing world, and that is so important, of course, too. But if the United States can clean up its electricity system, hopefully it can pioneer a lot of technologies that can be shared and used around the world. This is the same kind of dynamic that we've seen, for example, in Germany, when it pulled ahead and deployed a lot of solar photovoltaics that reduce the cost for the rest of the world. And this is something that Johannes covers in his book, Renewables. So, you know, I really feel that this is a really important thing. And if we clean up the electricity system in the United States, plus transportation and buildings, which we can do if we clean up and electrify those industries, then we actually get 70% of the carbon dioxide problem solved in the United States. So it gets us a long way to fixing the problem. Now, how are we doing in terms of making progress? Well, at the federal level, we're doing very poorly. There were efforts throughout the 1990s to try to pass a federal renewable portfolio standard, which is a target for how much renewable energy we need. Nowadays, we tend to focus on clean electricity standards, CESs, because that will include nuclear, which is a zero carbon emissions electricity source. But the point is, it's never worked. They've never passed. In 2009, we came the closest when a bill, the Waxman-Markey bill, passed the House, which included an RPS. The RPS, which was the target of how much renewables we had to have by a certain date, was 20% by this year, 2020. And it actually allowed 20% of that target to be met with efficiency, meaning that the target was only 12% for all the states by 2020. And you might say, well, that's not very ambitious anyway. But actually, a large number of states are below that 12% requirement right now. The worst states are Delaware and West Virginia, but even a state like Florida is only getting 15% of its electricity from clean energy sources right now. So we have huge differences across the country in terms of the pace and scale, and that's why a federal law is so important. There are some current efforts around creating momentum for 100% clean electricity standard by 2035. I really support those efforts. And in many ways, I think a federal clean electricity standard is my top wish list when it comes to the next Congress, depending on, of course, who is in power. Now, in the absence of federal leadership on this issue, states have really been leading the way. And so in the 1990s, states passed two main laws, which I cover in detail in my book. The renewable portfolio standard, which, as I mentioned, is a target, something like we're going to have 20% renewable energy by 2020. And a net metering law, which is basically the ability to put solar on your roof and feed the excess electricity that you are generating back into the grid and get paid a fair price, in this case, the retail price. So you're basically selling electricity back to the grid at the same price that you are buying electricity. And these ideas were actually incubated through a network of NGOs, of environmental advocates across the states. The Energy Foundation, which is a foundation started in 1990, really wanted to target action in the US on the electricity system. And what they did is that they funded a group of advocates working across the country, both in specific states as well as nationally. And those advocates both were kind of outside agitators pushing from the outside with sort of protests and traditional tactics. And then there were inside groups who were actually sitting down to negotiate specific rules with legislators. And that kind of strategy is how we got a lot of these laws passed. And you can see the wave of passage that happened throughout the 90s and the 2000s. So when we come to this time last year, states have pretty high targets across the country. In fact, this map is a little out of date. In many ways, Colorado, New Mexico, California, Hawaii, and New York all have 100% clean electricity targets. And so we have a couple states, including very big economies, that are targeting very aggressive clean electricity over pretty short timeframes. But as you can see here, the southeastern United States is way behind. They have no policies in terms of renewable portfolio standards. And actually next week, I will have a new report coming out about the Southeast and just how far behind it is on tackling the climate crisis across a wide variety of areas. And of course, that has racial justice implications because Black people overwhelmingly live closer to coal plants and other dirty fossil fuel infrastructure. And that, of course, poisons their lungs and makes them actually more likely to die from COVID. So, you know, there are huge injustices with the fact that some states are pulling ahead and starting to clean up their electricity system and others are really lagging behind. So in my book, I document the success that's happened and then point out that unfortunately, this success is not creating what we might think of as a virtuous cycle. So when advocates were thinking in the 1990s about passing these laws, what they wanted to do was get a little foothold where they would get, let's say, a 10% clean energy target. And what that would do is it would create a new industry. There would be new solar companies or wind companies. People would be paying taxes into local school boards in rural Republican parts of various states. And the idea was that as the benefits of the clean energy transition became clearer in terms of cleaning up the air, making jobs, then legislators would want to increase the law over time. But unfortunately, that isn't exactly what happened because it's not just advocates that are growing in strength over time. It's also opponents, groups that are tied to the fossil fuel past who are recognizing that actually these laws are threatening their bottom line. And so these opponents, these interest group opponents, have come to attack these laws over time. And the companies that I focus in on my book are fossil fuel companies and electric utilities. And I tell the story of all the ways that they have been resisting the clean energy transition. We could call some of these tactics climate delay, that they are trying to delay us shutting down coal plants, let's say, or, blocking natural gas permits. They're trying to delay the clean energy transition. And what the book does is it shows all the tactics that these companies are using to try to undermine policy feedback. There are things that you probably think of, like lobbying, right? If you are a powerful company and you maintain really good relationships with legislators, you can probably gain access and have a meeting with them and try to influence their thinking. And indeed, there's a bunch of political science work, including my own, which shows that the more money that these politicians are taking from fossil fuel companies or from specific groups or individuals, the more likely you're able to get a meeting with them, and the more likely they are to kind of see your views as the truth. But that's not the only thing that fossil fuel companies do and electric utilities. They also try to resist laws being implemented. So a lot of times we pay attention to the passage of a law in Congress or a state legislature, and we get really excited about that. But what a lot of us realize when we are working on policy in a deep way is that in some ways that's only the beginning of the fight. That implementation is where the rubber hits the road in terms of whether or not a law is actually going to change resources. So think, for example, of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. These are a very important law. They set rules for nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide and also mercury. Well, it turns out that it took almost over 2 decades to finalize those mercury regulations. They got caught up in legal battles because utilities didn't want to have to implement these rules because it would cost them a lot of money. They'd have to retrofit coal plants or maybe even shut down coal plants. And so it was 20 years between the passage of the law and its actual implementation through a rule. And you see that a lot of times. And there are also indirect ways that interest groups try to resist these policies through primaries and elections, through things called astroturfing, which I'll explain in a minute, as well as sort of using the public as a tool, and through court cases. So this is a kind of stylized model of how we can think about policy that I outline in my book. So you probably, as I mentioned, pay a lot of attention to when bills become laws, right? There's a lot of newspaper coverage of it. It's viewed as a really important thing. But what you might not realize as much is that after the bill becomes a law, it reshapes the political landscape. And this is an idea in political science that we call policy feedback, that the law itself can restructure the political system. We often think how the political system creates laws, right? The relationship between between politics to policy, but policy itself can reshape politics. And so in the case of clean energy laws, what these rules are doing is that they're taking away resources from fossil fuel incumbents. These are electric utilities and fossil fuel companies, and they are giving those resources or incentivizing the growth of new companies, clean energy companies, for example. And so as that shifting balance of power occurs, there are ramifications in the political system. So interest groups like electric utilities who do not like a new law, what they'll do is they'll go directly to the legislature to lobby. But they also go indirectly through lobbying. This is a concept that Ken Coleman has called outside lobbying, that rather than directly going to the legislature and saying, hey, these are our views on the law, we want you to change it back, what they do is they go to the public and they try to get the public to reach out to legislators and say, we would like you to change these things, right? So it's a way of organizing the public. Now, that can be done in a fairly honest way. So, for example, right now, there are big campaigns happening with the Black Lives Matter movement to try to organize the public and get them to reach out to local city councils, to weigh in on police budgets, for example. You know, that's real people who care about an issue and who want to try to change policy. But what fossil fuel companies and electric utilities are doing is that they're not being honest. They're being dishonest. And they're running what we could call an astroturfing campaign. So there's real grassroots, and I gave you an example of that. But there's also fake grassroots, which we call astroturfing. What's an example of that? Well, in New Orleans, there is an electric utility called Entergy, and they wanted to build a natural gas plant. And they had to go, in this case, to the city council to get the permit or to be allowed to build the plant. And a journalist went to the meeting to try to cover what was happening. And what the journalist was surprised to find was a lot of people there who were saying, we support the gas plant and we do not like solar. And the journalist thought this was very strange. Why were all these people here saying they didn't like solar and they liked the gas plant? Because if you look at public opinion data, for example, solar is very popular. It's like 90% support. So it's very strange. So the journalist went up to these people and they said, why are you here saying you don't like solar and you want this gas plant approved? And the people said, oh, we were paid to be here. We are actors. And the journalist uncovered that something like $25,000 was spent on hiring fake people to show up to the hearing to pretend like they wanted the gas plant approved. So that's a really particularly egregious example of astroturfing. But in my book, I document other kinds of astroturfing. So I tell the story of what is happening in Kansas. Kansas is a really windy state. I'm sure you realize that from Dorothy and, tornadoes and things like that. It's a very windy place, meaning that it's a great place to build wind energy. And so when the clean energy law was passed in Kansas, a lot of new jobs were created. And in western parts of the state, there was new local revenues coming into local governments. It was a really positive thing. And indeed, there were a lot of Republicans who supported this law. However, Koch Industries, which is a large fossil fuel company, that company is headquartered in Wichita, Kansas, and they decided that they did not like this clean energy law. And so they worked over several years to try to get rid of it. And if you're familiar with Koch Industries, maybe the Koch brothers or something like that, you might have heard of a group called Americans for Prosperity. And Americans for Prosperity is a kind of grassroots arm of this really big fossil fuel corporation. They spend a lot of money trying to organize people in this kind of outside lobbying way, in favor of their interests. And one thing that happened in Kansas is that a new organization popped up during this battle over the clean energy law, which Koch Industries wanted to get rid of. And the new organization was called the Kansas Seniors Alliance, I believe. And they put out this kind of a mailer. So this mailer was being sent out all over the state. And so a journalist said, wow, where is this coming from? They wanted to write a story about the seniors group that was really worried about rising electricity prices because of the clean energy law. So they went and they asked the lawyer that registered this group, right? You have to file paperwork to have a group. And they said to the lawyer, oh, who do you work for? Who runs the Kansas Seniors Alliance? Because there was no website, there was no real people involved. And the lawyer said, oh, I don't work for them. I only work for Americans for Prosperity. Again, that's the Koch Industries sort of grassroots group. So in other words, Koch Industries was very likely funding this fake campaign that wasn't really about a bunch of old people that were worried about their electricity bills. They just wanted to make it look that way. And so they created these mailers so that politicians would worry that a bunch of old people were really worried about this policy, when in fact, they were not. Another thing that interest groups are doing a lot at the state level to try to undermine clean energy laws is they're trying to shift political control. So, historically, clean energy and renewables was not a very polarized area, meaning there was a lot of bipartisan support for solar and wind. But over the last 12 years or so, there's been a massive polarization, and there's questions as to where that comes from. And in my book, what I argue is that it comes from interest groups, because one thing that interest groups are doing at the state level is that they are running primary challengers against Republicans that are pro-climate change or pro-clean energy. So again, in Kansas, there is a Republican named Russ Jennings who was in the state legislature, and he was from a western part of the state. He had seen a lot of benefits of wind energy, and he didn't want to repeal that law. And so what happened was he found himself with a very well-funded primary challenger. So they tried to basically replace him. And even if it doesn't work out, even if the Republican still wins their seat, it sends a chilling effect throughout the entire party, because any politician does not want a primary challenger. They do not want to have to struggle to keep their job. You can see this right now, actually, in New York. There's a really fierce primary challenge going on between Representative Engel and Jamal Bowman. Fascinating thing that will be decided, I think, in 6 days. And this is not something that they like. And so that's what interest groups are doing. They're creating incentives for Republicans to be anti-clean energy and anti-climate change. You see this very clearly at the federal level with the case of Bob Inglis. Bob Inglis was a Republican in Congress who wanted to act on climate change, and he found himself with a well-funded primary challenger, and in that case, he lost. So the fossil fuel companies are really driving polarization by using the primary system and the way they're using it. I also tell the story of Arizona Public Service, an electric utility in Arizona, which not only was funding primary challengers, but was actually funding primary challengers for their own regulator, because in Arizona, the regulator for the electric utilities is elected. And so they were literally choosing who was going to oversee them. It's a very unethical thing to happen because electric utilities are, in that case, a monopoly. Now, we know from political science research that when elites, politicians are polarizing, that tends to trickle down to the public. Because if I'm a Republican rank and file person and I hear Donald Trump saying he hates wind turbines, or I see Mitch McConnell being anti-climate action, I take that as a cue for what I should be thinking. So just as interest groups are driving polarization at the elite level through using the primary system, that is trickling down to the mass public in this time period. And so you can see here a massive drop off in support amongst Republicans for renewables after basically the Waxman-Markey bill in 2009. That's when the opponents are really mobilizing, right? So in my book, I go through a number of cases of clean energy, including some really classic ones like what happened in Texas. And I actually contest the conventional wisdom, which is that Texas is a great success on renewables. Yes, it has a lot of wind energy, the most in the country, but Texas is way behind in terms of cleaning up its electricity system. And indeed, it never even implemented its own solar energy law. I talk about Kansas and Koch Industries, as I mentioned. I tell the story of Arizona Public Service, which spent over $50 million over several years to try to undermine clean energy in that state. And again, it's a private monopoly utility. So it's basically using monopoly ratepayer money to roll back clean energy laws. And then perhaps the most sad story is the case of Ohio, where not only was there a rollback of renewable energy and energy efficiency laws, both of which, especially the energy efficiency law, were working very well, but there was also a bailout for several coal plants. And in the book, I estimate how much money that is, and it could be upwards of $5 billion that is being spent to keep coal plants operating for even longer, because these coal plants lose money every hour that they operate in this case, and rather than shutting them down, they're taking a massive government handout. The last thing I'll say is that the book tells the story of climate denial and climate delay. You may be familiar with the work of Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. They wrote a really great book called Merchants of Doubt. And Naomi Oreskes has also been working a lot with Jeffrey Supran on what Exxon knew about climate change and when. If you're not familiar with that work, I definitely check it out. There's also a documentary called Merchants of Doubt that tells the story. But what people don't really know is that electric utilities were just as involved as fossil fuel companies in promoting climate denial. And even before that, electric utilities have made a number of very pernicious decisions that have increased the wastefulness of our energy system. For example, if we use a technology called cogeneration, which is basically when we are burning fossil fuels and we're creating steam, that's just how it works, that steam becomes waste heat. But if you're using it on site with an industrial facility, you can use that steam to do other kinds of energy operations, and then you can use the electricity for something else. And that's a much more efficient system. But in the mid-20th century, what utilities did was that they gave extremely low contracts to industrial customers so that they wouldn't have their own on-site facilities. And so that actually meant that we burned a lot more fossil fuels than we would have otherwise. They also were very involved in the 1990s and 2000s in climate denial organizations like the Global Climate Coalition. And as I document throughout the book, they've been working very hard to resist clean energy laws and roll them back. If you're interested in this particular part of the book, I have a summary that I published on the website Drilled News, which is a great independent news site that talks a lot about what fossil fuel companies are doing to resist progress. Now, if you'd like to get a copy, it's a little bit difficult to do because it's been selling well, which is very exciting. So the best thing to do is go to bit.ly/scp-book, which will direct you to the Oxford University Press website. You can use this code here, and I'll put it in the chat box after I'm done with the slides, to get 30% off the book. So it's about $20 if you want to buy it that way. And the good news is that because the book's been selling well, I assume the ebook is really inexpensive. So you can also buy a copy of the Kindle for less than $12. And that's just bit.ly/scp-kindle. And that's the easiest way to get a copy because the physical book has been selling out a lot. But the best way to get a physical copy as fast as possible is to buy it from the Oxford University Press website. I also encourage you, if you want to support a local bookstore, to do that, and you can try to order it through then. It just might take a little longer to come. So thank you so much, and I'm really happy to have a conversation with all of you now. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and I'm sure Johannes will moderate them.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was a very, very exciting presentation. So we do have quite a few questions here. So why don't we jump right in? So the first question is from Ian Garvey, who is asking about sort of how do we deal with this issue of protecting, let's say, indigenous and protected areas when it comes to creating new clean energy facilities, wind farms, solar parks, dams, and he gives us an example, the Site C Dam in British Columbia, Canada. So any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with the Site C Dam controversy because I'm Canadian. You know, I think that the reality is that there are going to be big trade-offs going forward in the clean energy transition. And that, of course, doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. I think we need to be very clear-eyed about what the costs of continuing fossil fuel combustion is. They are extremely, extremely high. And not only is it high in terms of climate instability, but it's also very high in terms of human health, and particularly for Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous communities. So we can't be naive about that side of the ledger in terms of how bad the status quo energy system is. Now, as we talk about the transition, there are also costs and downsides there. And I'm not naive to that. I do a fair amount of work about those issues as well. And if you're interested in those kinds of questions and trade-offs, I'd recommend this book called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. You can download it for free. It was written by David Mackay, and unfortunately he died relatively young, but he was a really amazing British physicist who tried to outline for the public in an accessible way some of the trade-offs in the clean energy transition. So, you know, there are definitely conflicts with hydropower development. In the United States, there isn't a lot of new hydropower development that's possible. In Canada, there is more, particularly in Quebec and British Columbia. And there are questions about particularly Indigenous communities. So in Quebec, the Cree Nation, for example, has you know, a lot of territory in the areas where the hydropower could be developed, and there needs to be consultation with those communities to make sure that they want these things, and probably actual economic development flowing into those communities. And the same could be said in British Columbia, where of course salmon runs are a huge question in terms of how we treat our river systems. So yeah, it's not a simple question. I will say that hydropower has a lot of benefits of being part of the system because it allows us to match what we call intermittent resources. So hydropower can go up and down in a very flexible way, and wind and solar don't have those benefits. But it may be that we don't want to build certain dam sites and that they have certain negative downsides, and that we want to try to pioneer, for example, batteries technology. Now that too has downsides, right? Because if you're building batteries, it's an extractive technology, and you have to get certain minerals and you have to do mining. So, you know, our industrial system, which is what we all live in, it's how we have this webinar and everything else, it has downsides for sure. And the point going forward is how do we minimize those downsides? And continuing with a fossil fuel-based system is not at all the solution because we can't have a stable climate. And I live in a place in Santa Barbara where we've actually already warmed this area by 2 degrees Celsius. And that means we have droughts and fires and really intense impacts here. So we have to really think about, you know, what are the trade-offs and how can we make this transition as fast as possible while, you know, protecting species, protecting indigenous rights, and making sure that we have consultation. And those are real tensions, especially the question of speed and sort of consultation.
Got it. Perfect. Next, I have David Yaffe is asking, if adding renewables leads to an increase in average customer rates, what is the appropriate limit and how should such costs be allocated?
Yeah, interesting question. A lot of new modeling by Christopher Clack, and also a new report that came out a week or two ago from Grid Lab and the University of California, Berkeley, suggests actually that a renewables-based system is lower cost. And that is without even accounting, of course, for the negative externalities of the fossil fuel-based system. So part of the reason why we might, depending on the specific area, the specific utility, have higher rates as we move to cleaner sources is because the fossil fuel-based system is not paying for the full price of its system, right? This is the whole concept of externalities. It's also the reason why people talk about putting a price on carbon. And so, you know, I don't feel that cost is a reason to not go ahead. We have to think about the issue of income inequality, particularly in the United States. 1 in 3 Americans already struggles to pay their energy bills. And so as and if electricity bills are going up, we need to be thinking about ways that low-income people can still afford to pay their energy bills. And we also probably need to be thinking as a society about redistribution, about making sure that we don't have people living in such poverty. And that is part of the reason for the Green New Deal idea, you know, saying that we need to be paying people a minimum of $15 an hour. We need to have people have health insurance. We need to have people have a universal basic income or a job guarantee. These kinds of ideas are about saying that if people can't afford to live basic lives, then questions like their energy bill going up will not be as politically consequential, right? So I think that we can't put all the burdens of our dysfunctional society onto this problem, right? And I think we do have to understand that addressing climate change and addressing income inequality are fundamentally linked problems. I was thinking a lot today, looking at the cover of the New York Times, you can see that wealthy Americans have dropped their spending an enormous amount. And what the article was saying is that that has trickle-down effects on poor Americans, particularly in high-income counties. Fascinating. And it made me think, like, wow, what if we actually had like a less consumerist society and people weren't buying things? That's actually what the coronavirus is giving us a sort of taste of. And it doesn't really work well because poor people need rich people to keep buying stuff so that they have income. And we have to break that relationship. We have to say that poor people deserve a basic standard of living and deserve to have basic social services, regardless of whether or not we are consuming stuff or buying stuff. So I think there are some fundamental questions about how the American economy is working that need to be addressed. And it can't just be about tweaking sort of the electricity bills at the margin.
Okay, perfect. John is asking, are there any reputable nonpartisan resources to help stakeholders and policymakers determine reputable sources of public advocacy as opposed to, let's say, astroturfing? So any recommendations for John and the audience?
Yeah, there's lots of fantastic NGOs that do lots of great research on these issues. In DC, there's an organization called Resources for the Future, RFF. It's an economic think tank that does a lot of reports, particularly focused at the federal level in terms of analyzing legislation. At the state level, it's a bit hard. You know, I think, unfortunately, our opponents have been putting a lot more money into their own networks. So groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, Edison Electric Institute, the American Petroleum Institute. These are networks of fossil fuel companies, electric utilities, and in some senses, legislators. That's what ALEC does. And they're way better resourced. They're more organized. We don't have that on the left to the same degree, or even irrespective of a left-right, we don't have that in terms of the climate movement in the same way. And so a lot of the ways we find out about these astroturfing cases is from journalists just doing work. And often these journalists are local paper reporters, right? This isn't a national reporter. And so I think it is really important to support your local newspaper, to have a subscription, and, you know, maybe joining other organizations like the Sierra Club, for example, works very hard to try to shut down coal plants and is currently working on blocking gas plants. And so, Yeah, it's a difficult thing, and I feel we're a little outgunned at the state level right now, and I think that there does need to be more focus on sort of a network of advocates working together on climate policy.
Excellent. Next, I have Sandeep Pai, who's asking about the role of coal mining companies in kind of causing climate delay and denialism. Are they different? Are they similar to electric utilities?
Yeah, so those groups don't come up an enormous amount in my book, but they do a little bit. Certainly in the case of Ohio, there were coal barons involved in trying to secure that bailout for those coal plants. I would also point to the work of Timmons Roberts at Brown University, who has been doing work on climate denial from rail companies, because actually coal gets transported by rail, and so those rail companies wanted to continue to have the coal to move around, and so they became part of the climate denial network. And I think he's also done some work on coal companies too directly. So it's not what I work on, but of course some utilities are vertically integrated in terms of their inputs and their plants. So for example, Tri-State in Colorado is a rural electric co-op. It's actually a co-op of co-ops, and they own some mines as well as some coal plants. And that can be sort of an additional reason why a utility might resist the transition. And I always forget which one it is, but I think it's Consumers Energy in Michigan. That is an electric utility that has a vertically integrated gas pipeline as well as gas plants. And so when you have utilities that are both supplying the input to the fossil fuel plant and also running the plant, that creates kind of additional incentives to continue to use that resource. So yeah, I definitely would check out Timmons Roberts' work too at Brown University on this.
So next I have Patrick Bryant is asking about why don't we have more kind of rooftop solar, especially in states with net metering? Is it because property management companies don't have incentive to install these? Is there something what would you do to address this issue?
Well, that's a big part of my book. So if you're interested in that, I'd definitely check it out. Utilities hate rooftop solar. They do not like net metering. And I go into gory detail for why that is. In the late 1990s, there were some advocates funded by the Energy Foundation, including somebody named Tom Stars. He was a PhD student at UC Berkeley in the Energy and Resources group. And, he was trying to figure out what should I do my thesis on. And he went to a solar energy conference and heard about this thing called net metering. And he ended up working on it and then ended up going state by state to a bunch of states in the late 90s to try to get states to pass it. And a lot of states passed net metering laws with no fanfare, really. They were kind of unilaterally supported. They were they were unanimously voted on, and there wasn't a lot of controversy. Utilities didn't oppose them because in many ways, utilities did not understand the potential of solar energy. Utilities lived in this mindset, what we might call Tetlock's hedgehogs, right? These slow-moving organizations that aren't really up to speed on what's going on, and they just think they're going to keep burning fossil fuels forever, and that these hippies who are talking about wind and solar are out to lunch. So when these laws passed, they didn't really care, and it was only when the solar leasing companies started to be pioneered in the mid-2000s, and there started to be direct customer sales of solar, either as a purchase or a lease on people's roofs, that solar leasing started to take off and solar adoption started to take off. And that is when the utilities kind of started to freak out and understand the threat. In 2013, there was a report published by the Edison Electric Institute, which is the Association of Private Electric Utilities. It was called Disruptive Challenges, and it includes this idea of the death spiral, which is basically the idea that if a bunch of people adopt solar through net metering, then they're feeding their electricity into the grid. They're not paying very much. Then the system has a lot of fixed costs, of course. And so the idea is that a lot of those fixed costs will now have to be recovered from a smaller number of customers, and so everybody's rates will go up slightly. That will make it more economically viable for other solar customers to pop up and adopt solar on the roofs. They'll exit the system, and then before you know it, rates are going up and everybody's adopting solar, and then the private monopoly utility doesn't exist anymore, and it's a disaster. And so once they realized this, they started attacking solar net metering laws across the country. And so, you know, I don't know off the top of my head, but in my book, there's a fact that like 47 states had a proceeding on net metering in the last few years. Like basically anywhere there's a net metering law, there's a utility fighting it. And of course, and I find this very puzzling, the 2005 Energy Policy Act federally required states to do net metering, but some states never did it, just a handful. And I don't really know how they never did it, but places like Florida, for example, do not have a net metering law. And utilities, including municipal utilities, are very against customer-owned solar. So yeah, if you're interested in that, I tell a lot of the details of that in the book. And I think that that's where centering interest groups and their monetary interests helps you understand why we're not farther ahead on solar adoption, because there are groups in society that do not want us to be farther ahead on this.
Got it, got it. Next, I have Dylan Cohen, who's asking about the Citizens United decision. So how important do you think that was in all this climate delay and denialism?
Can you say that again, Johannes?
The Citizens United decision.
Oh, Citizens United. I heard cities somehow. Oh, Citizens United. How important is that? I think it definitely made things worse. There are some political scientists who do not believe that campaign contributions matter very much. They view them as consumption, right? Like I go buy, I don't know, some clothing and it brings me joy, or I go spend some money on a primary challenge, or give some money to Joe Biden and it brings me joy, and it's just consumption. I don't believe that at all. And that's because there's other evidence that suggests that that view of campaign contributions is wrong. And of course, that's not the popular view. It's not the media view. It's not what most people think. But I'll just give some context that within my discipline, there's some people who think that. There's a wonderful paper by Josh Calla and David Brockman, one of my favorites, where they did this experiment where they got a bunch of people to give campaign contributions to members of Congress. And then what they did was that they randomly assigned some people to say, hey, we gave you money, can we meet with you? And other people didn't say that. And what they discovered is that the people who reminded the politician that they were a campaign contributor were way more likely to get a meeting with the chief of staff, with the member themselves, with different parts of the organization. But more importantly, they just got way more access. So that is one paper that suggests that campaign contributors increase access. And these were for sort of small scale individual donors, not for like giant corporations giving a lot of money. I have a paper as well. It's called Legislative Staff and Representation in Congress. It's in the APSR with Alex Hurdle Fernandez and Matt Mildenberger. And what we did is that we tried to understand, do chiefs of staff and legislative directors in Congress understand that the public wants climate action? And what we show in the paper is that they do not. They dramatically underestimate support for climate action. And what we show is that the more that they're taking money from fossil fuel companies, the more that they're meeting with fossil fuel companies, the worse job they do at understanding the public support that exists. So campaign contributions and these meetings, which are a function of campaign contributions in part, are driving a wedge between what the public actually wants and what politicians think the public wants. And so these are some of the pernicious ways that campaign contributions are shaping our politics. And in terms of Citizens United, the case of Arizona Public Service is so egregious. I mean, there's like literally an FBI investigation that I document in the book. Like, it is just corruption. But anyway, the point is this utility, which has monopoly customers, right? You can't choose to go buy your electricity from somebody else. If you live in a certain part of Phoenix, you have to buy from Arizona Public Service. And what they're doing is they're taking the profits, which of course are guaranteed by the regulator, because that's how the utilities work. They get their costs plus some profits. They take their profits, they pass it on to their parent corporation called Pinnacle West. And then Pinnacle West spends $50 million over several years doing things like supporting primaries of Republicans for their own regulator, their own commissioners who support getting rid of net metering or support putting fixed fees, reducing solar independent ownership. They then put $40 million into opposing a ballot initiative that Tom Steyer and NextGen was supporting, which would have increased the renewable portfolio standard in Arizona. And, you know, this money in many ways is customer money, right? It's captured customer money. You can't buy your electricity from someone else. And it's profits technically, but all of this kind of stuff is allowed in part because of Citizens United. But to me, it seems dramatically egregious that you should be able to intervene in an election for your own watchdog, for your own regulator. That is not how a well-regulated system should work. It's not how a monopoly should be able to operate. So I do think that we need to change rules, which would be really difficult, around utilities. The one good thing is that because of all the bad press that Arizona Public Service has gotten by behaving in this way, they have a new CEO, and the CEO claims that he will not spend money on elections for his own regulator. However, Arizona Public Service has lied continuously in the past, where they say we're not spending money and then some journalist uncovers it. At one point, they literally probably funneled money through the Arizona State University Foundation. I mean, it's crazy. You really should read this. It's fascinating and in a very disturbing way. So, you know, and the new CEO, I'll say, was part of the leadership team under the old CEO. So he would have known all the decisions and the lying that was happening previously. So I think that people need to keep a close eye on Arizona Public Service and make sure that they're actually not continuing to act in these kind of corrupt ways.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about sort of where we are right now. So Prakash Kashwan from UConn is asking, what should we be doing kind of politically and in policy pretty much right now?
Yeah, I see a bunch of my like Twitter friends are on this call. So nice to see, or not see all of you, but hear all of you. My number one wish list, as I mentioned, is a federal clean electricity standard. Maybe 100% by 2035. It's quite ambitious, and it's actually quite ambitious for certain states, for certain utilities that have been laggards. They have just not been working on it. I mean, think about West Virginia, it's like 5% clean electricity. Think about Ohio, it's less than 3% renewables. They have nuclear, so they're better on other things, but there's so many laggards. And so we need the federal government to step up and say that all states need to be making progress in a timely fashion. Mm-hmm. And that Grid Lab report really suggests that it's not a technical feasibility problem, that we can get to 90% by 2035. And that's what we know today in 2020. So probably within the next 15 years, there'll be breakthroughs or new ideas for how we can squeeze out that last 10%. And we've also got to be growing the grid over the same time period to electrify transportation and buildings. And we need the federal government too to be setting standards in terms of getting gas out of homes, making homes more energy efficient, in terms of selling more electric vehicles. So my own view is that the path forward is centering benefits, centering the question of income inequality, and making sure that particularly Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous Americans who are paid a lot less money and are breathing in this polluted air, that they are centered in this, so that we bring them along. So the approach that I advocate is in line with what the former Inslee campaign, they now run a group called Evergreen Action, is promoting, which is called standards. You set standards, a renewable portfolio standard or a clean electricity standard, building standards, a zero emissions vehicle standards. You set rules. You basically say, here's where we're going, folks. Let's get moving. Then you say, the federal government will spend money on this issue, which, I mean, look at how much money they've been spending on the CARES Act, which is mostly propping up a fossil fuel industry and not building the clean energy future. That's wasted money. So we have money we can spend. And then centers justice to make sure that some of these issues of income inequality and rising energy bills don't get in the way of making the progress that we need to make to protect everybody. So that's the approach that I advocate for. I'm really excited about it. I think that it unlocks some of the stale debates we've been having about carbon pricing for like decades. And so that's my vision for the path forward. And, you know, people might say, oh, the deficit, or, oh, we can't afford it. But people don't understand that, like, climate change will cost us everything. It will ruin the entire economy, period. Like the social cost of carbon estimate exercises, which I enjoy at a certain degree, I also find comical at another degree, because it's like, you don't really understand climate change. Like, we could be passing thresholds and we no longer have a stable climate. We talk about runaway global warming, right? So I think that investments are totally worth it. And they'll also pay themselves back in terms of multipliers, because they'll create new industries and jobs, unlike putting bailout money into fossil fuel companies that are on the ropes anyway. So that is my vision. It is not implementable, which with Mitch McConnell in charge. So we also have to win elections.
So we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna combine some questions. So here are two specific questions. So first, Narayan Gopinathan is asking about California. So where did we get this virtuous cycle of growth with the renewable industry and a renewable portfolio standard and all these policies? And at the same time, Sandeep Pai is asking about nationalizing the fossil fuel industry. So can you just briefly comment on these two?
Two big topics. Okay. Well, on the California case, I have done that work. I've done a lot of interviews. I know the whole history. I haven't written it up yet. It's in my dissertation. So if you're really interested, you can go look up Power Politics, which is from 2015, the dissertation. But I'm going to write it probably as a law review article. But the key variable, I think, are two things in California that created the virtuous cycle. First, an intervenor compensation program, which is a policy of the Public Utility Commission, which pays advocates to show up and advocate for these things. So there's resources for these groups to kind of show up year after year. Second, unionization rates in California. And so the renewable energy industry really started to see that this was a benefit. And so unions started to get behind the clean energy transition and to be behind RPSs, and they have a lot of power in Sacramento. So without that relationship between pro clean energy unions and the environmental groups, I think it would be hard to have had such a virtuous cycle. And there's been some counter problems on that recently, because in the last few years, a couple refineries in California have been unionized. And, you know, there's lots of history of unions being on the wrong side of climate change. If you want to read that, you should look at Matto Mildenberger's new book, Carbon Captured. So, you know, unions can cut both ways, but in California, they've really gone in a pro clean energy way. Nationalizing the fossil fuel industry. Very complex topic. It's something I've been thinking a lot about. We have to not only be thinking about the Narwhal Curve side of the equation, right? Growing renewables, building industries, et cetera. We also have to be thinking about the stranded costs, stranded assets problem, which is all the money that companies have on balance sheets. And that can be a coal plant, it can be a gas plant in the utility sector, or it can be fossil fuel reserves in fossil fuel sector. Yeah, it's very complicated. I'm a little more familiar with it in the utility sector. There's been these ideas of securitization, which is basically like refinancing, like a mortgage, so that you can pay off your debt and shut down the plant. And the key thing is shut down the plant. You can't do what they're doing in Ohio, where you're subsidizing the plant continuing to operate. So, and you know, there are moral hazards and there's problems with that, but the alternative is that the plants keep operating. Similarly with the fossil fuel industry, if gas prices may continue to be low and, you know, these companies are in really bad financial straits, we could imagine that under the next administration that they could buy parts of the industry at sort of cents on the dollar and wind them down in a structured, managed way. Because otherwise we're just going to see potential bankruptcies, and that's not good for industries and people's livelihoods either. So yeah, I think there needs to be a lot of thinking, not just on the deployment positive side, but also on the how do we undo what we're in right now. And I think actually a friend of mine named Mark Paul is going to have a new working paper report on nationalizing the fossil fuel industry coming out soon. So you can check out that when it comes out.
Okay, perfect. So we are at the end of our time. So thank you again, Professor Stokes, for joining us for this webinar. Thanks to the audience for joining us and sharing all these really interesting questions. The discount code for the book, Short Circuiting Policy, is there in the chat window. So please take a look at it and take advantage of this opportunity to get a discount.
Bye. I really don't make a lot of money selling books, as Johannes knows, but it's more about getting the ideas out there. And the book, not to toot my own horn, but I think it's really interesting and you will learn from it. So yeah, go for it.
That is definitely clear. So again, thanks everybody for joining us, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the fall when we'll have another round of these webinars. Enjoy the summer in lockdown or whatever it is in where you are, and I'll see you all again in August. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Nice to see you, Johannes. Have a great afternoon.